It began with a silence so heavy it felt staged, the kind of pause that precedes either truth or spectacle. The chamber was full polished desks, cameras humming. Every pair of eyes fixed forward when Judge Andrew H. Stones leaned into his microphone. His words cut sharp, almost gleeful, slicing through the stillness. Representative Crockett is lying. The accusation didn't echo. It detonated. Gasps broke across the room, some muffled in disbelief, others loud with satisfaction. Stones sat upright, hands folded with the smug composure of a man certain of his authority. His voice carried that practiced courtroom gravity, the weight of decades in power, as if truth itself had been pronounced. He wanted the moment to feel final, but finality never came. All around him, the chamber changed. The still air thickened. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens scratching faster. Aides glanced at each other with widened eyes. Even the marble walls seemed to tighten, holding the words, pressing them into memory. Stones had turned the nation's stage into his weapon, branding a sitting congresswoman as dishonest with a single thrust. For Jasmine Crockett, those words landed like a gauntlet thrown at her feet. She didn't move right away. She didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch, let Stones stew in his own declaration, and that restraint spoke louder than any instant reply. Her gaze locked on him steady, unblinking, unafraid. The room, once his, now belonged to her patience. Because what Stones hadn't realized was that accusations don't always end stories. Sometimes they light them. And Crockett's story was only beginning. In that tense pause, something electric surged in anticipation that every witness felt but couldn't yet name. Viewers at home leaned forward, phones tilted upward to record. Reporters braced their questions, hungry for the soundbite that would define the night. Stones, believing he'd won with one sharp jab, had in fact scripted his own undoing. No one could predict what her response would be. No one could guess how quickly his attack would turn into her platform. But the countdown had already begun, invisible yet undeniable. What happened next wasn't just a rebuttal. It wasn't just political theater. It was a clapback heard across the internet, and it was about to shatter everything Judge Stones thought he controlled. The chamber where it happened was more than polished wood and microphones. It was a theater of power, a place where reputations were carved and broken beneath the eyes of the nation. Every word spoken inside those walls carried weight beyond the echo. To call someone a liar here was not a passing insult, it was a strike against their integrity, their future, and the people they represented. For Judge Stones, it was a calculated move. Diminish Jasmine Crockett publicly, strip her of credibility, and remind everyone who still thought authority belonged to men like him that the old order was alive and unshaken. But he miscalculated, because this wasn't just about Crockett. This was about what she stood for. She was a first-term congresswoman from Texas, a black woman in a chamber still learning how to respect voices like hers. From the moment she arrived, she had been underestimated. Critics had called her inexperienced, too bold, too unapologetic. They sneered at her cadence, her energy, her refusal to shrink herself into the neat, palatable boxes they expected. And every time they dismissed her, she answered with the same resolve. She belonged here. That day, Stones gave her another test, one that carried stakes far beyond her personal pride. To accept his accusation in silence would validate the perception that voices like hers could be pushed aside. To fight back would mean risking the caricature they were ready to paint. The angry black woman, who could be dismissed as emotional rather than precise. It was a tightrope walk, the kind of trap designed to corner her no matter which way she turned. And yet, history has shown that moments of attempted silencing often birth the most powerful declarations. The very tactic meant to box her in was about to hand her the biggest stage of her career. The cameras didn't just record that day, they broadcast to millions who recognized themselves in her fight. Every immigrant family told to wait their turn. Every woman doubted in a room full of men. Every young leader told to defer. They were watching. And they weren't watching Judge Stones. They were watching her. The chamber, once seen as cold and exclusive, now pulsed with tension that felt personal to anyone who had ever been doubted. Each second she sat there, unflinching, the suspense grew. Would she let the insult pass? Would she speak? How would she carve a path that cut through the stereotype and claimed her place as something more than a target? Stones didn't know it, but by hurling his accusation, he had rewritten the rules of the moment. He wasn't just sparring with a colleague, he was standing against the tide of change itself. Because Crockett had been underestimated before, and each time she turned that underestimation into fire. This was not the first attempt to strip her dignity, but it was perhaps the boldest stand, therefore the most dangerous for Stones. The room wasn't just waiting for her words, it was daring her to rise, and Jasmine Crockett was never one to back down from a dare. The stillness before her answer was not hesitation. It was calculation. The kind of silence that makes opponents overconfident, the kind that primes the audience for an eruption. But Crockett wasn't about to let this insult stand, and the timing of her response was explosive. Judge Andrew H. Stones was not a man who stumbled into power. He was born into it, raised in a family where influence was currency and connections paved the way long before talent or merit had a chance to speak. His father had been a lawyer, with a reputation for defending corporations against workers' claims. His mother, a fixture of elite charity galas where policy was shaped as much by whispered conversations as by legislation. From the start, Stones learned that power wasn't something earned through fairness, it was something wielded, something taken, and, if you held it tightly enough, something you never had to surrender. By the time he became a judge, he carried himself less like a servant of the law and more like a monarch dispensing rulings from a throne. His words were final, his tone laced with condescension. His bench is staged for theatrical dismissals of anyone who dared to question him. When a notorious case, when an immigrant family stood before him seeking justice against a landlord who had neglected their unsafe living conditions, Stones had waved away their testimony as emotional exaggeration, siding instead with the property owner. When reporters pressed him afterward, he smirked and quipped, "Not every sob story is a case." That kind of arrogance followed him everywhere. In speeches, he often spoke not of fairness or equality, but of order and respect. Respect, in his view, always flowed upward, toward authority figures like himself, fairly downward toward ordinary citizens. He reveled in calling young activists idealists with no grasp of reality. He dismissed female attorneys with patronizing praise that barely concealed his skepticism of their ability. In quiet moments, caught on hot mics, he had been heard joking with colleagues about how the new wave of representation was more about optics than competence, and yet Stones never paid a price. His network shielded him, his seniority excused him, and his confidence cemented him as untouchable. He was the kind of man who thrived in silence because silence meant compliance, and compliance was what kept him on top. That's why the chamber felt so comfortable to him, its rigid traditions, its rehearsed decorum, all tools he could bend to maintain his control. He believed that in that room, his voice was law and his authority unquestioned. So when he leaned forward and accused Jasmine Crockett of lying, it wasn't just an insult. It was the purest expression of his belief system, that he could define reality by declaring it, that he could reduce her truth to nothing more than noise. He didn't worry about evidence. He didn't fear backlash. He had spent a career believing. He was immune. But arrogance has a way of leaving cracks, and Stone's career was littered with them. There was the case where he dismissed video evidence as circumstantial while praising the testimony of a wealthy executive. There were whispers of rulings that curiously favored donors connected to his campaigns. There were the countless young leaders who walked away from his chambers shaking their heads, muttering the same phrase over and over. He doesn't listen. He doesn't care. He just rules. The problem for Stones was that arrogance blinds as much as it elevates. He was so used to controlling the room that he mistook Crockett's silence for submission. He believed his accusation had landed, that her stillness was proof of defeat. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that her silence was not surrender. It was strategy. Every second she held his gaze. Every heartbeat she refused to fill with a rushed rebuttal was a choice. She was allowing his words to hang in the air, not because they carried truth, because she knew how quickly they would turn against him. Crockett wasn't playing his game of instant domination. She was setting the stage for something larger, something he couldn't anticipate. And Stones, for all his bluster, had no idea the ground beneath him was shifting. He was used to controlling the room, his smirk, his tone, his authority designed to silence opponents before they ever found their footing. But this time, that dominance was about to backfire because Jasmine Crockett's stillness wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble halls of Congress or in the spotlight of national politics. It began in neighborhoods where dreams often met barriers, where families worked twice as hard for half as much, and where voices like hers were rarely invited into rooms of power. She grew up in Dallas, Texas, the daughter of a working-class family who understood that survival required grit, and that grit required standing tall, even when the world preferred you bowed. From an early age, Crockett carried that weight. She saw how her community was treated: underfunded schools, overlooked neighborhoods, promises from leaders that evaporated once the cameras left. She knew what it meant to feel invisible, and she vowed she would not remain so. In classrooms, she was the student who raised her hand even when teachers rolled their eyes. On the playground, she was the one who stood between bullies and the kids they targeted. That instinct to protect, to defend, to fight was not learned, it was lived. Her path to politics was never smooth. When she entered college and later law school, she carried the pressure of being the first or the only in too many rooms. Professors doubted her. Classmates whispered that she was too loud, too passionate, too unwilling to play the polite game of ambition. But Jasmine knew that being quiet had never saved her people. It was the raised voices, the stubborn ones, the so-called too much that pushed change forward. So, instead of softening, she sharpened. After becoming an attorney, she didn't seek the comfortable path. She didn't align herself with corporations or elite firms. She opened her doors to those who had none: the working poor, the immigrants. Caught in a web of bureaucracy, the families who faced eviction without legal aid. She built a reputation not by shaking hands at galas, but by showing up in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients and fighting anyway. Judges dismissed her, opposing lawyers mocked her, but time after time, she walked out. With victories no one expected, that fire brought her to politics. She saw firsthand how laws shaped lives, how systems bent to protect the powerful while leaving the vulnerable exposed. Running for office was not about ego, it was about necessity. It was about putting someone in the chamber who understood what it meant to be underestimated, overlooked, and written off. And when she won her seat in Congress, it wasn't just her name on the ballot that triumph hit, it was every neighbor, every family, every young girl who had been told she wasn't enough. Her arrival in Washington, however, was not met with open arms. The establishment eyed her with suspicion. Colleagues dismissed her as a freshman who needed to learn her place. Critics painted her as confrontational, too fiery, too unpolished for the polished stage of national politics. But Crockett leaned into the very qualities they mocked. She turned her so-called rough edges into armor, her passion into power, her refusal to shrink into a refusal to fail. She carried her community with her in every hearing, every speech, every late-night drafting session. When she spoke about healthcare, she spoke for families who rationed insulin. When she fought for voting rights, she thought of the elders in her district who had marched, protested, and risked everything for the ballot. Her voice was not solitary, it was an echo of millions. That is why Stone's accusation cut deeper than a personal attack. To call her a liar was not just to question Jasmine Crockett. It was to question every person she represented, every story she carried, every truth spoken by those who had been silenced before. She wasn't just defending herself in that chamber. She was defending the credibility of her people. And Crockett understood that. She'd always understood that. When she locked eyes with Stones, it wasn't the look of a woman insulted. It was the gaze of someone who knew the fight was bigger than ego. Her silence wasn't fear. It was the same calculation she had practiced. Her whole life waiting for the right moment to strike, so that her words would land not just in that chamber, but in the hearts of everyone watching. Every challenge she had faced prepared her for that moment. The teachers who doubted her voice had trained her to project louder. The judges who dismissed her clients had sharpened her arguments. The critics who mocked her fire had taught her how to turn mockery into momentum. All of it, every barrier, every slight, every underestimation was fuel, and in that chamber, with the weight of history pressing down and the cameras capturing every heartbeat, all of that fire was ready to erupt. It would not erupt in rage. It would not erupt in a flurry of reckless words. It would erupt in precision, in dignity. In a clapback so sharp, it would slice through the noise and leave the nation stunned. And all of that fire was about to erupt in a single, unforgettable clapback. The chamber had not yet exhaled from the shock of the first accusation when Judge Stones leaned back toward his microphone, unwilling to let the silence breathe. His voice rose again, sharp and deliberate, the tone of a man determined to erase any doubt. I'll repeat it so there's no confusion. Representative Crockett is lying, and the record should reflect it. The words landed heavier the second time. The first had been audacious. Second carried the weight of conviction, as though repetition itself could turn fiction into fact. Murmurs rippled across the room, a low buzz of unease. Some lawmakers shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable with his brazenness, while others smirked quietly, satisfied that someone had dared to go on the offensive. Cameras zeroed in, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes, capturing every flicker of expression. The networks knew a moment was unfolding, one that would be replayed, dissected, and memed before the night was over. Journalists' pens scratched faster, and phones lifted discreetly from aides' desks, sneaking footage too. The outside world in real time, Stones, sensing the attention, straightened his posture. He relished the stage, basking in the murmurs that followed his repetition. His jaw tightened with the self-assurance of a man convinced the chamber still belonged to him. His fingers tapped the desk in a steady rhythm like a drummer setting. The tempo of the conflict? He wasn't just calling her a liar anymore. He was daring her to respond. And still, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. Her stillness was magnetic. She didn't shuffle papers or fumble for notes. She didn't lean toward her mic. She simply sat, hands folded, expression composed, her eyes fixed on him like a beam of unbroken focus. The tension in her stillness grew unbearable. Viewers at home might have mistaken it for restraint, but those who knew her understood. Silence was her weapon. Around her, the chamber shifted restlessly. Aides leaned toward their bosses, whispering about strategy. Cough echoed. A chair creaked. Even the air seemed charged with anticipation. The audience was no longer listening to Stones. They were waiting for her. Every second of silence ratcheted up the suspense, pulling tighter and tighter, until the room felt like a coiled spring on the verge of release. Stones pressed again, perhaps unnerved by the lack of reaction. The truth matters here. Allow misrepresentation to go unchecked. If Representative Crockett won't correct herself, then let it be known that this chamber will not tolerate dishonesty. His words were meant to humiliate, to box her into submission. Instead, they exposed something else entirely: his growing desperation. Each repetition sounded less like dominance and more like a man trying to convince himself he had already won. The arrogance that once commanded the room was starting to stretch thin, revealing cracks beneath its surface. Crockett, however, remained steady. She didn't glance around for allies. She didn't bow under the weight of his performance. Inside, she felt the familiar fire rising, the same fire that had carried her through courtrooms stacked against her. Campaigns where odds were mocked as impossible, debates where opponents underestimated her again and again. She knew that once she spoke, her words had to cut sharper than his accusations. Her presence had to eclipse his performance. Timing was everything. The chamber felt it too. The murmurs quieted, replaced by a hushed anticipation that bordered on reverence. Even those who had nodded along with Stones now shifted uneasily, realizing the silence was not weakness but preparation. Reporters lifted their pens, waiting. Cameras zoomed closer. The audience leaned forward. It was the calm before the storm, And then, without warning, Jasmine Crockett moved. She straightened her spine, leaned forward, and placed her hand near the microphone. Her eyes never left his. The air thickened as the molecule paused, waiting for what would come next. Stones stiffened, sensing the shift but unable to stop it. Then she leaned forward, locked eyes with Stone's, and the chamber braced itself. Her fingers brushed the microphone, and the chamber seemed to stop breathing. All eyes fixed on Jasmine Crockett, waiting, bracing, knowing instinctively that something bigger than politics was about to unfold. She leaned forward, her posture firm yet fluid, as though every inch of her carried the weight of generations behind her. When her voice finally broke the silence, it was calm to calm. The kind of calm that chills rather than soothes, Judge. Stones, she began, her tone clipped, deliberate, each syllable dropped like a stone into still water. You've made an accusation, a bold one. I want to thank you for that. Gasps flickered through the room. The idea of thanking him was absurd, unthinkable, and yet she said it with the authority of someone in control of the script. Stones shifted slightly, uncertain whether to smirk or scowl, because when a man in power, so confident in his privilege, thinks he can stand here and rewrite reality simply by saying it twice, well, it tells the entire country more about you than it does about me. The silence snapped. A ripple of murmurs spread across the chamber, aides darting glances, reporters' pens racing to capture every word. Stone's jaw tightened, but Crockett was not finished. She was just warming up. Her voice rose, precise and sharp, each word, cutting against the arrogance that had dripped from Stone's accusation. You see, I come from a community where words like yours aren't just insults, they're weapons. They've been used to dismiss us, to silence us, to erase us. But here's the thing about weapons. They lose their power when we refuse to be afraid of them. Faint smile tugged at her lips, not of joy but of triumph. Her eyes never left him, and the steadiness of her gaze made him squirm. He attempted to interrupt, leaning toward his microphone, but she lifted her hand ever so slightly, and the chamber obeyed her pause. Stones froze, caught between arrogance and a growing recognition that he had lost command. You call me a liar? She continued, her cadence now accelerating, each sentence layered with rhythm, building momentum. But what you fear what? Terrifies you is that I tell truths you don't want the world to hear. Truths about broken systems, about families ignored, about communities like mine that don't get the privilege of your courtroom courtesy. Gasps turned into nods. A daze leaned back, caught between disbelief and awe. Across the room, a few. Lips curled into restrained smiles. Even her opponents couldn't deny the energy that was shifting. Crockett wasn't defending herself. She was redefining the terms of the fight. And then she delivered the turn. If my words shake you this much, Judge, imagine what it means for the people watching at home. Imagine the little girl seeing, maybe for the first time, that someone who looks like her doesn't back down when men like you try to write her out of the story. The chamber reacted audibly this time. A low wave of MMS, a scattered applause quickly hushed. The rustle of bodies leaning forward, drawn in as though witnessing history being carved in real time. Stone's face flushed, his composure faltering. He opened his mouth to retort, but found nothing to anchor his words. Crockett, sensing the moment, pressed forward. You accuse me of lying? But I wonder, Judge, how many lies have survived in this room because people like me weren't here? To challenge them? How many times have truths been buried under the weight of your authority? Well, those days are ending. Her tone sharpened. But it wasn't uncontrolled. It was measured, surgical. Each sentence dismantled him piece by piece. Stones once relaxed, and Smug now sat rigid, his fingers twitching against his desk, his eyes darting toward allies who avoided his gaze. The camera zoomed in on his face, catching the subtle reddening of his cheeks. It's a telltale sign of unraveling. You don't scare me. Your accusation doesn't scare me. It won't scare anyone who understands what's really happening here. You're not defending truth. You're defending the comfort of a system that has always placed you above accountability. But the truth is louder than your voice. And tonight, the truth is mine. A rumble coursed through the chamber. Some clapped softly before being hushed. by procedural decorum. Others exchanged glances that said what words couldn't. This was more than a rebuttal, it was a dismantling. Stones tried once more, fumbling for a response. His voice caught in his throat, producing only a stammer before he pushed his microphone away. He leaned back, his face taut with frustration, his authority suddenly fragile. The same man who minutes earlier commanded the room now sat diminished. Eclipsed by a fire he could not extinguish, Crockett paused, letting the image of his unraveling sink in. Her silence now was not defensive, it was victorious. She leaned closer to the mic one final time, her voice low but thunderous in effect. So yes, you can call me a liar if it makes you feel powerful. But tonight, the whole country just saw the truth. It's not me who should be worried about history remembering this moment. The chamber gasped, then erupted in noise applause, shouts, murmurs, all colliding into a sound too big to contain. Reporters scribbled frantically, phones lit up with texts and tweets. And within seconds, the outside world was echoing what had just unfolded inside. Judge Stone sat frozen, stripped of his smugness, swallowed by the weight of silence that was no longer his to control. And Jasmine Crockett. She leaned back, composed, unshaken, knowing exactly what she had just ignited, and the chamber erupted. The eruption inside the chamber was only the beginning. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett's clapback began flooding timelines. Staffers, who had discreetly recorded the exchange, uploaded it to Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. In less than an hour, the hashtag #CrockettClapback trended nationally. By midnight, it was global. The video spread like wildfire.
Out.
TikTok creators stitched her takedown with slow-motion edits, bold captions, and background music that turned her words into an anthem. One viral edit overlaid her line, "The truth is mine," with pounding bass, the frame zooming in on her steady gaze as Stones visibly faltered. It racked up millions of views before the night was over. Memes followed just as quickly. Screenshots of Stone's reddening face paired with captions like "When you realize you picked the wrong opponent" or "Liar. Sir, the only lie is your confidence." Twitter was no gentler. Blue-check commentators blasted out instant takes. Journalists called it the moment that stole the chamber. Progressives dubbed her a hero. Even moderates admitted her composure was surgical. Celebrities joined in, actors, musicians, athletes posting the clip with emojis of fire, clapping hands, and broken microphones. One late-night host tweeted, "Forget summer blockbusters. Tonight's drama just dropped in Congress." By morning, Crockett's words weren't just a comeback, they were a cultural statement. The New York Times ran with the headline, "Crockett's clapback reverberates." Nationwide, cable networks looped the footage, with pundits parsing every second of her delivery, some calling it one of the most memorable congressional exchanges in a generation. Editorial boards praised her courage. Even critics grudgingly admitted she had outmaneuvered Stones. On Instagram, young women across the country posted clips of her speech with captions like, "This is why representation matters, and she spoke for all of us." College students reenacted the moment in dorm rooms, mimicking Stone's accusations before lip-syncing to Crockett's clapback. On TikTok, teenagers who had never watched a congressional hearing before were quoting her lines in dance videos. But perhaps the most powerful reactions came from those who felt personally validated. Immigrants wrote threads about being told they were exaggerating when speaking their truths, only to see Crockett dismantle that very dismissal on national television. Black women, long stereotyped for their tone, or dismissed for their passion, said her composure and fire gave them a mirror of resilience. Parents showed their daughters the clip, pointing to Crockett as proof that silence could be strategy and voice could be power. Meanwhile, Judge Stones became a meme of downfall. His once confident smirk was repurposed as the face of arrogance, crumbling. Headlines described him as flattened, cornered, and outclassed. Analysts pointed out that his attempt to dominate the room only amplified Crockett's presence. The irony was rich. The man who sought to silence her had instead handed her the loudest microphone in the nation. Late-night comedy piled on. Monologues replayed Stone's accusation, followed by Crockett's rebuttal. The punchline delivered not by comedians, but by the chamber itself, erupting as he sat stunned. One host quipped, "That wasn't a debate. That was a public service announcement." On what happens when arrogance meets preparation. The audience roared. The cultural resonance ran deeper than trending hashtags. Commentators drew parallels to historical moments when underestimated voices seized the stage. Barbara Jordan during Watergate, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the House floor, Shirley Chisholm standing unbought and unbossed. Crockett's name, now added to that lineage, circulated in op-eds declaring a new voice of truth in Congress. But for all the viral glory, the moment wasn't about entertainment. It was about validation. Millions who watched saw not just a congresswoman defending herself, but a woman embodying a universal lesson. Arrogance collapses when confronted with clarity and courage. It wasn't merely a political clapback, it was a cultural mirror reflecting who held power, who challenged it, and why it mattered. Still, as the memes multiplied and the hashtags surged, a quieter shift was happening. People weren't only laughing at Stone's humiliation, they were rethinking what dignity and leadership looks like. They weren't just entertained by Crockett's words, they were emboldened by them, because beneath the memes was something deeper, a shift in how millions saw power, truth, and dignity. In the days that followed, as the headlines cooled and the hashtags began their slow fade, Jasmine Crockett's words remained. What had begun as a personal defense inside a tense chamber was now being replayed in classrooms, church halls, and family living rooms. Parents used it as a teaching moment for their children, that dignity once claimed cannot be taken away. Teachers played the clip to show how truth, delivered with clarity, can cut sharper than any insult. Crockett herself didn't linger on the spectacle. In interviews, she refused to make the story about her ego. "It wasn't about me," she said plainly. "It was about respect for the truth, for the people I represent. And for anyone who's ever been dismissed when they dared to speak." Those words reframed the moment entirely. What Stones had tried to reduce to a petty clash became a broader lesson. Arrogance may shout, but dignity endures. The power of her response wasn't in humiliating an opponent. It was in refusing to bow to him. Where Stones had leaned on entitlement, Crockett had leaned on service. Where he tried to control the room, she reminded it that authority flows not from arrogance, but from accountability to the people. That reversal carried weight far beyond one chamber. Spoke to a universal truth. Leadership is not domination, it is representation. For every immigrant who had been told their accent made them less credible, Crockett's composure was a reminder that authenticity is strength. For every woman interrupted or dismissed in a meeting, her poise proved that silence can be strategy and voice can be victory. For every young leader doubted before they even began, her rise showed that underestimation is often the soil where resilience grows. Her clapback wasn't just a viral moment. It was a collective win for everyone who has ever been silenced, shamed, or sidelined. In her refusal to shrink, Crockett created space for others to stand taller, speak louder, and believe that they too belonged. And Stones? His arrogance became a cautionary tale. The lesson wasn't just that he lost the exchange, but that his brand of authority rooted in entitlement and outdated dominance was crumbling before the eyes of a new generation. The contrast could not have been sharper. The old guard clinging to power through dismissal, and the new guard claiming it through truth. The moment then was bigger than politics. It was about how a single exchange in a room where history is written could echo outward into the culture at large. Crockett reminded the nation of something often forgotten. Courage doesn't always look like grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like a steady voice refusing to bend under pressure. Sometimes it looks like grace under fire, precision under attack. And sometimes it looks like one woman standing in the face of arrogance and saying, in so many words, "You will not define me." The chamber that day became more than a battleground of egos. It became a mirror, reflecting the choice America faces between leaders who serve themselves and leaders who serve the people. In Crockett's defiance, in her clarity, in her refusal to let an insult stand, the moral was plain. Dignity outlasts arrogance, service defeats entitlement, and truth will always cut through the noise. As the cameras captured her final words, As the nation replayed them again and again, a quiet realization took hold. What mattered wasn't the volume of Stone's accusation, it was the resonance of Crockett's response, because sometimes a single voice is all it takes to remind a nation what courage sounds like. Judge Andrew H. Stone's may have thought his accusation would end the conversation, but Jasmine Crockett's viral clapback proved otherwise. What began as an attempt to silence her has instead become a rallying cry, a reminder that in the face of arrogance, truth has a way of rising louder, stronger, and more enduring. This wasn't just political theater. It was a lesson in resilience, in the power of carrying yourself with dignity when the world tries to strip it away. And that's why this moment matters. It's not about one chamber, one judge, or one exchange. It's about every person who has ever been told they don't belong. Every voice that's been cut off mid-sentence. Every truth that's been buried under the weight of arrogance. Crockett didn't just answer Stone's, she answered for all of them. If you believe dignity always wins, share this story. Let it ripple outward. Let it remind others that arrogance can roar, but it cannot last stand at the quiet strength of courage. Can reshape the narrative. This channel isn't just about replaying political drama. It's about amplifying those moments where history shifts, where courage meets arrogance and refuses to bend. If you felt that shift today, if you believe in truth over bluster, service over entitlement, then join us. Subscribe, stay with us. Movement, and be part of something bigger. Because the fight for dignity, for respect, for truth, it's far from over. And every voice matters. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one clapback, one leader willing to stand tall. The next could. Come tomorrow. Don't miss it. Stay here. Stay ready. Stay part of the fight.